The final confrontation began simultaneously across three fronts as the galaxy reached its breaking point. In the council chambers on Kepler Prime, Ambassador Chen Wei stood with representatives of the liberated species as they demanded the complete dissolution of the corrupt government. In the Void Swarm's home system, Captain Morrison led the desperate mission to free the imprisoned consciousness that powered the galaxy's greatest threat. And on the research world of Sanctuary, Lieutenant Colonel Parker raced against time to prevent the activation of the final protocol. Admiral Thompson coordinated all three operations from her command ship, knowing that failure on any front would doom the entire galaxy to eternal slavery. The communication systems buzzed with reports from across known space as the revolution reached its climax. Morrison's fleet approached the heart of Swarm territory with every ship that could be spared from other operations. The task force included vessels from 43 different species, their crews united by a shared determination to end the nightmare that had consumed so many worlds. The human captain stood on his bridge and watched the twisted landscape of the Swarm's home system appear on the main screen. The enemy's birthplace was a monument to perverted science and corrupted life. Entire planets had been stripped of their original matter and rebuilt into massive organic processing centers where stolen consciousness was refined and merged into the collective weapon. The space between worlds crawled with swarm vessels that moved like living things, their hulls pulsing with the rhythm of countless trapped minds. Dr. Carter, her research finally complete, addressed Morrison and his senior staff as they prepared for the assault. The swarm's central consciousness is held in a facility on the third planet, she explained. It's protected by the strongest concentration of enemy forces we've ever encountered, but it's also the source of their power. If we can break the containment field and free the trapped minds, the entire swarm network will collapse. The plan required volunteers to link their minds directly with the swarm consciousness, risking their sanity to introduce the chaos needed to shatter the control systems. Morrison knew it was essentially a suicide mission, but when he asked for volunteers, nearly every human in the fleet stepped forward. "I'll lead the mental link team," Morrison announced, ignoring the protests of his officers. "Human neural patterns are the most resistant to the programming that created this mess. If anyone can survive direct contact with that thing, it's us." Commander Sullivan, now leading the ground assault team, prepared his Marines for the most important battle in galactic history. The landing would take place on a world that existed only to house the imprisoned consciousness of extinct civilizations, defended by creatures that had once been those same civilizations. Meanwhile, on Kepler Prime, the council chambers erupted in chaos as the ancient leadership realized their authority was crumbling beyond repair. The Prime Speaker's tentacles writhed with fury as it addressed the assembled delegates. "The final protocol will be activated immediately," the ancient being declared. "Order will be restored even if we must rebuild galactic civilization from nothing." Ambassador Chen Wei stepped forward, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "You've already destroyed galactic civilization," he said. "You've turned living beings into weapons, imprisoned anyone who dared to think freely, and created the very enemy that now threatens to consume everything. Your 1,000 years of peace was built on the graves of countless species who deserved better." The Draxian representative, War Master Korth, stood beside Chen with his ceremonial battle armor gleaming. "My people remember when the sky was full of different ships, when every world had its own songs and stories. You took that from us and called it progress." Dr. Zara of the Crystal Singers added her voice to the growing chorus of condemnation. "You silenced the music of the spheres itself, reducing the beautiful complexity of existence to your gray uniformity. No more." On Sanctuary, Parker's assault team fought through the research facility's final defenses as alarms screamed throughout the complex. The council technicians were desperately trying to activate their ultimate weapon before the humans could stop them. Engineer Prime Vex worked frantically to override the containment field controls, while Parker and her Marines held off waves of automated defenders. "The system is incredibly complex," Vex reported over the sound of weapons fire. "They've built redundancies into every component. Even if I disable the primary controls, they can activate the protocol manually." Parker realized they needed a different approach. Instead of trying to prevent the activation, they would have to survive it and find a way to turn the weapon against its creators. "Can you modify the targeting parameters?" she asked Vex. The Kelgari engineer's eyes lit up with understanding. "If I can access the core programming, I might be able to redirect the consciousness transfer. Instead of consuming free-thinking beings, it could target the psychological conditioning that creates Council loyalists." In the Swarm's home system, Morrison's mental link team prepared for their descent into Nightmare. The volunteers included Dr. Hayes, who had studied the enemy longer than anyone, Sergeant Brooks, whose stubborn courage had first proven humans could resist swarm attacks, and a dozen other humans who understood that failure meant the end of freedom for every living being in the galaxy. The link chamber was a horrifying organic structure that pulsed with malevolent life. As the team entered, they could feel the weight of millions of enslaved minds pressing against their consciousness. The Swarm's central intelligence spoke to them without words, its communication carrying the despair of countless extinct civilizations. Morrison forced himself to maintain focus as alien thoughts invaded his mind. He could feel the presence of the Helix nomads still mourning their destroyed wandering fleets, the Crystal Singers, their beautiful music twisted into screams of anguish, the Iron Builders, their proud cities reduced to tools of destruction. "Hold on to who you are," Morrison broadcast to his team through their neural links. "Remember what we're fighting for. Remember the people we've saved, the worlds we've liberated, the hope we've given to beings who thought freedom was impossible." The human minds began introducing chaos into the Swarm's perfect order. Every unpredictable thought, every moment of stubborn defiance, every refusal to accept despair created cracks in the control systems that had held the collective consciousness prisoner for centuries. On Kepler Prime, the Council leadership made their final desperate move. Ancient weapon systems came online around the capital world, preparing to sterilize any planet that harbored free-thinking beings. The genocidal plan would reduce the galaxy's population by 90%, but the survivors would be perfectly obedient servants. Chen Wei and the liberated species representatives found themselves under attack by Council security forces. But they were not alone. Younger delegates from dozens of species inspired by the human example rose up in support of the revolution. The Council chambers became a battlefield as beings who had been conditioned for submission rediscovered their capacity for resistance. The tide turned when Warmaster Korth challenged the Prime Speaker to single combat, invoking an ancient right that predated the Council's formation. The alien leader tried to refuse, but the watching delegates demanded that the challenge be honored. As the two beings faced each other in the center of the chamber, 1,000 years of oppression hung in the balance. Back on Sanctuary, Parker's team achieved their breakthrough. Vex successfully modified the final protocol's targeting systems just as the Council technicians activated the weapon. Instead of consuming free minds, the consciousness transfer began targeting the psychological conditioning that had enslaved the galaxy. Across Council space, beings who had lived their entire lives in submission suddenly remembered what it felt like to think for themselves. The effect was instantaneous and irreversible. Centuries of mental conditioning evaporated as millions of individuals reclaimed their capacity for independent thought. In the Swarm system, Morrison's mental link team felt the change as it rippled through the collective consciousness. The imprisoned minds began to remember their individual identities, their original hopes and dreams, their love for the civilizations they had been forced to destroy. The Swarm consciousness started to fragment as its component parts reclaimed their freedom. Ships across the enemy fleet stopped moving in perfect coordination and began following the individual wills of their crews. Some continued fighting, driven by grief and rage over their lost homelands. Others simply stopped, overwhelmed by the return of emotions they had forgotten for centuries. Morrison felt the mental barriers that held the collective together beginning to collapse. "Now," he broadcast to his team. "Push through with everything we have. Show them what it means to be free." The humans' chaotic neural patterns provided the final catalyst needed to shatter the Swarm's unity. Individual consciousness exploded, outward like a supernova of liberated thought. carrying with it the memories and cultures of dozens of supposedly extinct civilizations. On Kepler Prime, the Prime Speaker fell before War Master Korth's ancient blade, its death cry echoing through the council chambers. The alien delegates looked around at each other with new eyes. Lieutenant Alex Carter discovered the council's betrayal during what should have been a routine intelligence mission. The younger brother of Dr. Sam Wilson had volunteered for a dangerous reconnaissance operation deep in council space, hoping to gather information about swarm movements. What he found instead was evidence of collaboration that made his stomach turn. Hidden within the encrypted databases of a council military station, Alex uncovered communication logs that detailed months of secret negotiations between council leadership and the Void Swarm. The conversations were conducted through intermediaries, using codes and protocols that suggested this was not the first time such arrangements had been made. The council was not just providing intelligence about human fleet movements, they were offering humanity as a sacrifice in exchange for a promise that the swarm would leave council core worlds alone. Worse, the negotiations included detailed plans for eliminating other problematic species that had joined the human liberation movement. Alex transmitted his findings to the human fleet just hours before council forces launched their coordinated attack. The betrayal was perfectly timed to coincide with a major swarm offensive, forcing humanity to fight on two fronts while their supply lines were cut and their communications were jammed. Captain Morrison, now commanding a battle group of 30 ships from 12 different species, received Alex's warning just as council vessels began attacking his supply convoys. The enemy ships bore the familiar markings of the Galactic Council Defense Force, but their actions marked them as traitors to every principle they claimed to represent. "All ships, this is Morrison," he broadcast on the command frequency. "We are being attacked by council forces while engaged with the swarm. This is not a mistake or a misunderstanding. They have chosen to side with our enemies rather than allow free beings to determine their own fate." The battle that followed tested everything the liberated species had learned about fighting together. Council forces attacked with precision and coordination, following battle plans that had been refined over centuries of maintaining order through superior firepower, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to break under pressure. The Draxian heavy cruiser, Righteous Fury, positioned itself between Morrison's flagship and 3 council destroyers, absorbing massive damage while its crew sang their ancient war songs. The Kelgari engineering ship Bright Star used its modified mining equipment to tear through council shields that were supposed to be impenetrable. The Crystal Singer vessel Harmony's voice projected acoustic attacks that disrupted council computer systems and drove their crews to distraction, but it was the humans who held the line when everything seemed lost. When the council forces brought up their dreadnought Eternal Order, a massive ship designed to cow entire star systems into submission, it was human fighters that swarmed around its hull like angry insects, striking at weak points and drawing fire away from the larger vessels. General Nick Foster, coordinating the defense from his command ship, watched the battle unfold on tactical displays that showed the impossible becoming reality. The Council's superior numbers and technology should have won the day easily, but they were losing because they could not understand their enemies. "They're fighting like this is a military exercise," Foster observed to his staff. "Perfect formations, textbook maneuvers, everything by the book. But they've never had to fight people who refuse to follow the script." The human forces did not fight like any military force in Council records. They improvised constantly, taking risks that no rational commander would approve, supporting each other in ways that defied tactical logic. When their ammunition ran low, they rammed enemy ships. When their ships were crippled, they kept fighting with whatever weapons they had left. Most importantly, they never abandoned anyone. When the Draxian cruiser's engines failed and left it dead in space, human ships formed a protective formation around it, while engineers worked to restore power. When a group of Crystal Singer fighters became separated from the main fleet, human pilots fought their way through council lines to bring them home. Dr. Hayes, working frantically in her laboratory aboard Morrison's flagship, made the breakthrough that changed everything. Her analysis of captured swarm bioforms had revealed something that explained their entire existence. The Void Swarm was not just created from pacified species. They were a living weapon designed by the Council itself. The genetic modifications, the psychological conditioning, the systematic elimination of free will, she explained to Morrison, during a brief lull in the fighting. It was all part of a long-term project. The Council didn't just want to control the galaxy. They wanted to create the perfect weapon against anyone who might threaten their authority. The swarm was the Council's ultimate insurance policy. If any species became too powerful or too independent, they could unleash the swarm to consume them. The enemy that was currently terrorizing the galaxy was the same force that had been used to eliminate dozens of civilizations over the past millennium. But something had gone wrong with the Council's control systems. The swarm had grown beyond their ability to direct it, and now it threatened to consume everything, including the Council itself. The ancient leadership was trying to make a deal with a monster of their own creation, offering up humanity as a
meal in hopes of satisfying its endless hunger. Commander Sullivan led a desperate mission to rescue prisoners from the Council's maximum security facility on Omega Station.
The station held thousands of beings who had been deemed irredeemably resistant to pacification protocols. These were the individuals who had refused to surrender their free will, no matter what the Council did to them. The assault on Omega Station required everything the human fleet had learned about fighting impossible odds. The station's defenses were designed to repel invasion fleets, not small assault teams, but they were also automated systems that followed predictable patterns. Sullivan's Marines, led by Sergeant Brooks, used the same tactics that had worked against the swarm. They moved unpredictably, struck at unexpected targets, and refused to be intimidated by overwhelming firepower. When the station's defensive systems tried to herd them into kill zones, they split up and attacked from 12 different directions at once. The prisoners they found inside Omega Station represented the best and brightest of dozens of species. Scientists who had asked dangerous questions, artists who had created unsettling works, leaders who had inspired others to think for themselves. All of them had been locked away because their very existence threatened the Council's vision of perfect order. Among the rescued prisoners was Korth, the last free Draxian War Master, whose refusal to submit had made him a legend among his people. There was Dr. Zara of the Crystal Singers, whose research into quantum consciousness had been deemed too dangerous to allow. There was Engineer Prime Vex of the Kelgari, whose innovative designs had been banned for being excessively creative. These individuals had spent decades or even centuries in isolation, but their spirits had not been broken. When they learned what humanity and the other liberated species had accomplished, their joy was explosive. They had proof that their sacrifices had not been in vain, that somewhere in the galaxy, free beings were still fighting for the right to be themselves. Admiral Thompson coordinated the galaxy-wide liberation effort from her command center on Earth. Reports flowed in from dozens of star systems where human-led coalitions were breaking open Council facilities and freeing imprisoned populations. The revolution was spreading faster than the Council could respond to it. But Thompson knew that the real test was still coming. The Council leadership would not surrender their authority without a final, desperate gamble. Intelligence reports suggested they were preparing to activate something called the Final Protocol, a contingency plan that had been developed centuries ago to deal with the ultimate threat to their power. The nature of the Final Protocol was unknown, but its existence had been hinted at in captured Council documents. It was described as a way to restore order through absolute means, and was only to be used when the Council itself faced extinction. Thompson studied star charts showing the positions of human and allied forces across the galaxy. They were winning individual battles and liberating millions of enslaved beings. But they were also stretched thin across hundreds of systems. If the Council had a secret weapon, this would be the perfect time to use it. Lieutenant Colonel Parker led the assault on the Council's primary research facility on the hidden world of Sanctuary. The planet did not appear on any official star charts, but captured prisoners had revealed its location. According to their information, Sanctuary was where the Council's most dangerous experiments were conducted. The research station was protected by defensive systems that made Omega Station look like a training exercise. Automated weapons platforms, energy barriers, and swarms of robotic defenders surrounded the facility like layers of an onion. But Parker's assault team had something the designers had never planned for. They had beings who had been victims of Council experiments fighting alongside them. Dr. Zara used her knowledge of quantum mechanics to predict and counter the station's defensive algorithms. Warmaster Korth led a team of Draxian volunteers in a frontal assault that the news of humanity's victory against the Void Swarm spread through the galaxy faster than official Council reports could suppress it. Within weeks, secret communications began reaching Earth from species across the Rim territories. The messages all carried the same desperate plea: please help us. Admiral Kate Thompson sat in her office at Earth's Starfleet Command and read through the latest batch of encrypted transmissions. The Kelgari engineers, forced to work only on basic maintenance for the past 2 centuries, begged for human assistance in defending their homeworld. The Draxian warriors, whose fighting spirit had been systematically crushed by Council psychological conditioning, asked for help remembering how to fight. Most disturbing of all were the messages from species that had never been allowed to develop: space travel. The Council had kept them trapped on their homeworlds for hundreds of years, claiming it was for their own protection. Now, with the swarm approaching, they faced extinction without ever having seen the stars. Thompson's contemplation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Council's emergency headquarters on Kepler Prime. The message was delivered by the Prime speaker itself, and its tone made clear that this was not a request. Earth Command will cease all military operations in Council space immediately, the ancient being declared. Human forces will return to Earth's solar system and remain there until this crisis has passed. Any violation of this order will be considered an act of war against the Galactic Council. Thompson turned off the message and looked at her staff. Officers. The room was silent for a long moment before she spoke. Gentlemen and ladies, they had their chance to handle this situation. Now step aside. Captain Roy Henderson had spent the last month investigating Council records that Dr. Hayes had uncovered. What he found painted a picture of galactic civilization that made him sick to his stomach. The Council's 1,000 years of peace had not been achieved through diplomacy or cooperation. It had been built on the systematic destruction of every species that valued individual freedom. Henderson discovered files documenting something called the pacification protocols. Whenever a species showed signs of independent thinking or resistance to Council authority, teams of specialists would be sent to their homeworld. Using a combination of advanced psychology and subtle genetic manipulation, they would slowly change the species' fundamental nature. Some races were turned into hive minds where individual thoughts were impossible. Others were given genetic modifications that made them naturally submissive to authority. The most stubborn species were simply eliminated, their worlds listed as natural disasters or evolutionary failures in the official records. The process had taken centuries, but eventually the Council had created a galaxy full of beings who never questioned orders, never took risks, and never stood up for themselves or others. They called it civilization, but Henderson recognized it as something else entirely. It was slavery dressed up in fancy words. Dr. Sam Wilson worked in a secure laboratory beneath the surface of Earth's moon, studying captured swarm bioforms that Sullivan's fleet had recovered from Altair 7. What he discovered changed everything humanity thought they knew about their enemy. The swarm creatures were not alien invaders from another galaxy. They were the remains of species that had once lived in Council space, beings that had been subjected to pacification protocols that went horribly wrong. Instead of creating obedient servants, the process had stripped away everything that made them alive, leaving only hunger and rage. Wilson found genetic markers from dozens of different species within a single swarm entity. The Helix people, who had been relocated 300 years ago after refusing to abandon their nomadic lifestyle. The Crystal Singers, whose beautiful music had been deemed emotionally destabilizing by Council censors. The Iron Builders, whose magnificent cities had been torn down because they encouraged excessive pride. All of them were still there, trapped within the swarm's collective consciousness, forced to destroy the very things they had once loved. The Council had not eliminated troublesome species. They had turned them into weapons against freedom itself. Lieutenant Colonel Grace Parker led the first human assault on one of the Council's Reformation centers on the planet Telos IV. These facilities were supposed to be educational institutions where young beings from various species learned proper Council values. The reality was far more sinister. Parker's Marines breached the facility's outer defenses and fought their way through automated security systems that had been designed to contain prisoners, not protect students. What they found inside made even hardened combat veterans stop and stare in horror. Thousands of beings from dozens of species were held in conditioning chambers, their minds being slowly rewritten by sophisticated brainwashing technology. Children who had shown too much curiosity, adults who had asked too many questions, elderly beings whose memories of their species' original culture were deemed dangerous to Council stability. "My God," whispered Parker as she walked through endless rows of prisoners. "How many places like this are there?" The answer came from the facility's database, which Parker's tech specialist, Corporal Lisa Barnes, managed to crack after several hours of work. There were over 200 Reformation centers scattered across Council space, holding millions of beings whose only crime had been thinking for themselves. As human forces began liberating these facilities, they encountered species that had been written off as extinct centuries ago. The Thunder Dancers, whose powerful rituals had been banned for being too primitive. The Stargazers, whose deep philosophical questions had been deemed socially disruptive. The Dreamweavers, whose artistic visions had been considered mentally destabilizing. All of them had been quietly disappeared by the Council and subjected to reformation. Those who could be broken were eventually released as model citizens. Those who could not be broken were kept locked away forever, or worse, turned over to the researchers who had created the Void Swarm. Meanwhile, humanity's growing fleet of liberated species had their own encounters with the Swarm. The Draxian warriors, their fighting spirit restored by contact with human military advisors, discovered that their ancient battle songs could disrupt swarm coordination. The Kelgari engineers, freed from centuries of boring maintenance work, created new weapons that targeted the technological components within swarm entities. Most importantly, these species began to remember what they had lost. They remembered the joy of making their own decisions, the satisfaction of creating something new, and the fierce pride that came from protecting others. These memories were like poison to the swarm, weakening their psychological attacks and making them vulnerable to conventional weapons. Commander Sullivan, now leading a joint fleet of 27 species, received intelligence that made his blood run cold. Council forces were not just withdrawing from the battle against the swarm, they were actively providing the enemy with information about human fleet movements and tactical capabilities. The Council had decided that humanity was more dangerous to their authority than the swarm was to galactic civilization. If they could not control humans through intimidation, they would eliminate them through betrayal. Sullivan's communications officer, Lieutenant Rogers, intercepted coded transmissions between Council commanders and unknown recipients. The messages contained detailed information about human patrol routes, supply convoy schedules, and defensive positions. Someone in the Council hierarchy was feeding intelligence to the enemy. "They're setting us up," Rogers reported grimly. "They want the swarm to destroy us so they can go back to their peaceful galaxy without any troublemakers." Sullivan gathered his senior officers for an emergency briefing. The tactical situation was becoming impossible. Human forces were fighting the swarm on dozens of fronts while simultaneously dealing with supply shortages caused by Council interference. Now they faced the possibility of direct betrayal by the very organization they were trying to save. Dr. Carter, who had been analyzing swarm behavior patterns for months, presented her latest findings to the assembled officers. "The swarm's strength comes from fear and despair," she explained. "Every time a species gives up hope or surrenders to terror, the swarm grows stronger. But every time someone fights back with courage and determination, they grow weaker." She brought up a holographic display showing swarm activity across the galaxy. "Look at this pattern. In sectors where the Council has maintained strict control and order, the swarm advances easily. But in areas where liberated species are fighting alongside human forces, they're being pushed back. The implications were staggering. The Council's entire philosophy of peace through control was not just wrong, it was actively feeding the enemy. The swarm drew power from the very qualities that the Council promoted: submission, fear of change, and the willingness to sacrifice others for personal safety. As the briefing concluded, Sullivan made a decision that would define the rest of the war. "We're not going to beat this enemy by following Council protocols or trying to work within their system," he announced. "We're going to show the galaxy what happens when free beings stand together and refuse to surrender." Ambassador Chenwei stood before the Council one final time, but this time he was not alone. 3 months passed after humanity's latest rejection from the Galactic Council. During that time, reports began reaching civilized space of strange attacks on frontier worlds. The news was scattered and confused at first, with many officials dismissing the reports as exaggerated tales from nervous colonists. The truth became impossible to ignore when the planet Xerion 7 went completely silent. The Council's response was swift and predictable. Emergency sessions were called, defensive positions were established around core worlds, and evacuation orders were issued for 17 species living on the galactic rim. Commander Pete Sullivan commanded a small patrol fleet near the edge of human space when the distress calls started coming through. His 3 ships, the UNS Valiant, UNS Courage, and UNS Freedom, were conducting routine border patrols when the communication systems erupted with desperate pleas for help. "This is Altair Colony 7, came a voice crackling with static and fear. "We are under attack by unknown hostiles. They came out of nowhere. Our defenses are falling. Please, anyone who can hear this, we need immediate assistance." Sullivan stood on his bridge and listened to the calls flooding the emergency channels. Dozens of worlds were crying out for help, and according to his instruments, Council forces were pulling back to defensive positions hundreds of light-years away. Lieutenant Katie Rogers, his communications officer, looked up from her station with concern. "Commander, I'm receiving new orders from Earth Command. We're ordered to return to home space immediately and maintain defensive positions." Sullivan studied the tactical display showing the locations of the distress calls. The Altarian colonies were only 2 days away at maximum speed. The Council, forces that should have been protecting them, were already retreating. "Commander," said his tactical officer, Lieutenant Ben Carter, "the Altarians helped us establish our first trade routes in this sector. They shared their star charts and warned us about dangerous navigation hazards." Sullivan made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. He turned to his crew and spoke in a voice that left no room for doubt. "We don't leave people behind. Set course for the Altarian system, maximum speed." The 3 human ships jumped into hyperspace while Council forces continued their retreat to safety. When they emerged in the Altarian system 2 days later, they found a scene of devastation that none of them were prepared for. Dr. Amy Carter, the fleet's chief scientist and Ben's older sister, worked frantically at her sensors as they approached Altair 7. "I'm reading massive energy signatures across the planet's surface," she reported. "But there's something wrong with the pattern. It's not random destruction. The enemy ships were unlike anything in the galactic databases. They moved through space like living things, their hulls seeming to pulse and shift as if they were made of organic material rather than metal. When they attacked, they did not just destroy buildings or kill defenders. They consumed everything they touched, leaving empty husks where thriving cities had once stood." "My God," whispered Sullivan as he watched the main screen. "They're not just attacking the colonies, they're eating them." The first engagement between human forces and the Void Swarm began when Sullivan's ships attempted to evacuate survivors from Altair 7's northern continent. The swarm vessels moved to intercept them, and what followed challenged everything humanity thought they knew about space combat. The enemy ships fought with tactics that seemed impossible. They anticipated every move the humans made, as if they could read their intentions before the orders were given. Worse, the human crews began experiencing strange psychological effects during the battle. Fear seemed to pour from the enemy ships like radiation, making it difficult to think clearly or coordinate attacks. It was Sergeant First Class Danny Brooks who made the first breakthrough. Brooks led a squad of Marines attempting to secure an evacuation site on the planet's surface when they encountered swarm ground forces. The creatures were horrifying to look at. combining features from dozens of different species in ways that hurt the mind to perceive. When the creatures attacked, they projected waves of pure terror designed to paralyze their enemies. Most species would have fled or surrendered immediately. But Brooks and his Marines did something that surprised everyone, including themselves. They got angry. "These things killed innocent people," Brooks shouted over the sound of weapons fire. "They're trying to scare us into running away so they can murder more families. Well, I'm too mad to be scared right now." His squad rallied around his words and fought back with a ferocity that caught the swarm creatures off guard. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Void Swarm encountered beings who could resist their fear-inducing attacks through sheer stubborn determination. Dr. Carter analyzed the battle data as the evacuation continued. "The swarm's tactics depend on psychological warfare," she explained to Sullivan. "They feed on fear and despair. The more terrified their enemies become, the stronger they get. But our people are fighting back with anger instead of fear, and it's disrupting their combat effectiveness." Word of the human resistance spread quickly through the swarm's collective consciousness. For centuries, they had swept through the galaxy encountering species that either fled in terror or tried to negotiate for mercy. Neither strategy worked against an enemy that consumed everything in its path. But humans were different. When faced with an impossible enemy, they did not run or surrender. They stood their ground and fought back, even when victory seemed hopeless. More importantly, they refused to abandon others who needed help. The evacuation of Altair 7 took 3 days, and cost Sullivan's fleet dearly. The UNS Courage was badly damaged and had to be abandoned after her crew was transferred to the other ships. But they saved over 50,000 Altarian civilians and military personnel, people who would have died if the humans had followed orders and stayed in Earth space. News of the rescue operation reached the Galactic Council chambers within hours. The reaction was not what humanity might have hoped for. Instead of praise for their heroism, the Council expressed anger and concern about humans operating outside their assigned territories. Ambassador Chen Wei found himself called before an emergency session of the Council leadership. The Prime Speaker's tentacles writhed with agitation as it addressed him. "Your species has violated direct orders and interfered with Council military operations," the ancient being declared. "This reckless behavior demonstrates exactly why humanity cannot be trusted with greater responsibilities." Chen listened to the accusations with growing disbelief. "Our people saved 50,000 innocent lives. How is that reckless behavior?" The Zephyrian delegate leaned forward in its seat. "By refusing to follow proper evacuation protocols, you put Council resources at risk. The Altarian system was designated as a loss. Your interference has complicated our strategic planning." "Strategic planning?" Chen's voice rose despite his training in diplomatic protocol. "You abandoned 17 species to die. What kind of strategy involves sacrificing millions of people without even trying to save them?" The Crystalline Consortium representative made a sound like breaking glass. "The survival of the core civilizations takes priority over peripheral colonies. This is basic strategic thinking that your emotional species cannot understand." Chen looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates. Many avoided his gaze, but he could see something in their expressions that had not been there before. Some showed shame, others showed confusion, and a few showed something that might have been admiration. As the formal reprimand continued, Chen realized that the Council was not angry because humans had violated orders. They were angry because humans had succeeded where the Council had failed. For the first time in 1,000 years, someone had fought the Void Swarm and won. Meanwhile, Sullivan's damaged fleet limped toward the nearest human outpost, carrying refugees from a dozen different species. The people they had saved looked at their human rescuers with something approaching worship. These strange emotional beings had risked everything to help strangers, something that most civilized species considered impossible to understand. Dr. Carter worked around the clock analyzing the data from their encounters with the swarm. What she discovered would eventually change the course of the war, but for now it was just a theory that seemed too incredible to believe. The Void Swarm was not just an enemy force. It was the corrupted remains of civilizations that the Council had tried to pacify over the centuries. Every species that had been deemed too chaotic or unpredictable had either been absorbed into the Council's rigid structure or had simply vanished from the galaxy. The swarm was what happened when living beings were stripped of their individuality and free will. They had become a weapon designed to destroy the very qualities that made life worth living: hope, courage, and the willingness to help others even at great personal cost. As Sullivan's ships jumped toward safety, carrying their precious cargo of refugees, the galaxy began to buzz with rumors of the human rescue mission. Species that had cowered in fear for months began to whisper among themselves about the crazy humans who had fought monsters and won. The Galactic Council could no longer ignore the human spirit, but they had not yet realized that ignoring it had never been an option in the first place. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance and watched the stars through the main screen. His ship floated in the darkness near Earth's moon, waiting for news from the Galactic Council. The message came through the communication system with a cold electronic voice that made Jake's jaw tighten. "Application denied," the voice said. "Humanity's request for full council membership has been rejected for the 7th consecutive year. Reason given: insufficient demonstration of advanced civilization markers and peaceful coexistence protocols." Jake turned off the message and looked at his crew. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Wells, his second in command, shook her head in disgust. "7 years in a row," she said. "What do they want from us?" The answer to that question was something that bothered many humans across the galaxy. Earth had achieved faster than light travel 50 years ago, and since then they had explored dozens of star systems. They had built colonies, established trade routes, and never started a war with any alien species they met. Yet the Galactic Council treated them like children who could not be trusted with important decisions. On the other side of the galaxy, Dr. Lisa Hayes sat in her laboratory on the research station orbiting Kepler Prime. She was Earth's chief xenobiologist, and her job was to study alien species and understand how they lived. What she had discovered in recent months made her stomach turn. Lisa pulled up her research files on her computer screen. For weeks she had been studying the Council's records of every species that had been granted full membership in the last 300 years. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Every race that joined the Council shared certain traits. Some were hive minds where individual thoughts did not matter. Others had rigid caste systems where everyone knew their place and never questioned authority. Many were extremely careful about taking any risks. Species that valued individual thinking, like humans, were kept at the bottom of the Council hierarchy. They were given labels like emotionally unstable or dangerously unpredictable. The Council seemed to fear any race that encouraged its people to think for themselves. Lisa saved her files and prepared to send them to Ambassador Chen Wei, Earth's representative to the Council. Chen was scheduled to make another plea for humanity's membership the next day, and Lisa wanted him to know what he was really facing. The Council chambers were a marvel of alien architecture. The building was made of living crystal that grew from the ground and reached toward the stars. Inside, representatives from 847 different species sat in perfect rows, each in their assigned place according to their rank in the Council hierarchy. Ambassador Chen Wei walked to the center of the chamber. He was a small man compared to many of the alien delegates, but his voice was strong when he spoke. "Honored representatives," he began, "I come before you once again to request full membership for humanity in the Galactic Council." The Zephyrian delegate, a tall creature with silver skin and 4 arms, made a sound that might have been laughter. "The humans return with the same request," it said in a voice like wind through metal. "Have they learned to control their emotional instability? Have they developed proper respect for authority?" Chen's face remained calm, but his hands clenched at his sides. "Humanity has contributed to galactic peace and prosperity. Our scientists have made discoveries that benefit all species. Our merchants trade fairly with everyone. Our soldiers have never started a conflict." The Crystalline Consortium representative, a being made of living gems, spoke next. "Their chaotic nature makes them unsuitable for civilized society. They question orders, they take unnecessary risks, and they refuse to accept their proper place. Such behavior threatens the order we have maintained for 1,000 years." Other delegates nodded in agreement. The hegemony representative, whose species had not spoken an original thought in centuries, added, "The humans must prove they can follow guidance without question before they deserve consideration." Chen looked around the chamber at the hundreds of alien faces. Some showed pity, others showed contempt, but none showed support. "What must we do to prove ourselves worthy?" he asked. The council's prime speaker, an ancient being whose species had founded the organization, raised one tentacle for silence. "Humanity must demonstrate that it can maintain order and stability. It must show that it will not disrupt the Yao peace we have created. Until then, your application remains denied." Chen bowed his head respectfully, but inside he felt anger burning. He had studied the council's idea of peace, and he did not like what he saw. It was not peace built on justice or cooperation. It was peace built on fear and control. As the session ended and the delegates began to leave, Chen noticed something. That made him pause. In the far corner of the chamber, a group of younger delegates from various species watched him with interest. They did not speak, but their eyes showed something the older delegates lacked. They showed hope. Far away from the political games of Kepler Prime, something stirred in the dark spaces between stars. Ancient sensors detected movement in regions that had been empty for 1,000 years. Computer systems that had slept for millennia began to wake up and assess the galaxy around them. The void swarm had been dormant for so long that most species had forgotten they ever existed. The Council's records mentioned them only as a historical footnote, a minor threat that had been dealt with by their predecessors long ago. But the swarm had not been destroyed. They had been waiting, growing stronger in the darkness, preparing for the day when they would return to reclaim what they believed was theirs. The galaxy had grown soft and comfortable under the Council's rule, and the swarm sensed weakness. Scout ships began to move through the outer systems, testing defenses and gathering information. They moved carefully, staying hidden from the Council's detection networks. What they found pleased them. The galaxy's defenders were predictable, following ancient protocols that had not changed in centuries. Captain Morrison received new orders as his ship prepared to return to Earth. The message was simple: stay in Earth space and await further instructions. Do not engage with any unknown contacts. Do not investigate unusual sensor readings. Do not act without Council approval. Jake read the orders and felt the familiar frustration that came with being treated like a child. His crew was trained and ready for anything, but they were kept on a short leash by beings who did not trust them to make good decisions. He thought about Dr. Hayes and her research, about Ambassador Chen and his failed attempts to gain respect, about all the humans across the galaxy who were tired of being ignored and dismissed. Something would have to change soon, or humanity would spend forever trying to prove themselves to people who would never accept them. In the darkness between stars, the void swarm continued to move toward the inhabited worlds, and the galaxy's greatest test was about to begin.